Thank you for joining the Vegetable Educational Conference. I'm your moderator, Justin Shealy, with the University of Georgia's Cooperative Extension Service in Eccles County. There we go. Most of the research presented has been funded in part by the Georgia Commodity Commission for Vegetables. These are your dollars at work. For all Georgia vegetable growers growing 50 acres or more of a certain vegetable commodity, be on the lookout for the 2024 ballots to extend assessments for the Georgia Commodity Commissions for Vegetables. Assessment funds vegetable research, education, promotional projects. Commissioners commit 75% of the funds for research projects. All right, with announcements out of the way, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Babesh Dutta, UGA Extension plant pathologist for vegetables.
Thank you, Justin. Well, good morning. Thank you for your patience. I'm Babesh Dutta. I'm Extension Vegetable Specialist at UGA Tifton. Today I'm going to share some of the snapshots of the field trials and the fungicide efficacy trials and also disease management options for different vegetable crops. I cannot talk about all the vegetables because we could only close to 35 different vegetables, and each vegetable crop will have 5 or 6 different pathogens. If you multiply it together, you will be talking about 170 different pathogens and fungicide trials, which I'm not here. So I'm going to give you some of the gist of my trials. So before I start, there's a news. There's a proposal from the EPA that they're going to reduce the use of chlorothalonil by 30 to 50% in variety of vegetable crops. Now, this is a proposal. This has not yet been cemented. So we have an option to give our opinion and write our opinion on how important chlorothalonil is or Bravo is in vegetables. And you all know chlorothalonil is a mainstay in most of the fungicide programs in vegetable crops. We use chlorothalonil as a tank mixing partner or as a rotation partner. It is one of the most important fungicide, broad spectrum fungicide that we utilize to reduce the chances of fungicide resistance development. So please, please, please take your time to put at least a couple of sentences on how important this chlorothalonil is in your operation. All right, going back to the business. The first disease which I want to talk today is Fusarium wilt of watermelon. It's one of the most important vegetable disease in cucurbits, and in watermelon it has been devastating. Over the last 4 or 5 years, I would say over the last 7 to 8 years, there is an increasing trend of this particular disease, especially in southern Georgia. What you're seeing is a snapshot or drone image of a Fusarium fungicide trial here, and this is what Fusarium can do. This is your 3-week-old plants, and they've been infected. Each and every plant was infected with the Fusarium. Okay, there's news from Syngenta. Miravis Prime has received a soil use label for Fusarium wilt. This is a big deal. This came from after 4 or 5 years of our hard work. So we got this label where the rate of Miravis Prime for soil level use is 13.4 to 15.4 fluid ounce in melons. And there are different variety of way you can apply it. You can use it as a broadcast or pre-plant incorporated, banded surface spray. You can also use it as a transplant water. I do not know how long it's going to stay like that, but you can right now, it got a transplant water use. You can also overhead, you can also drip irrigate. So it's a variety of ways you can use this. With respect to banded application, 7 to 10 inch banded application under the plastic is recommended right before transplanting. If you are soil broadcasting, you need to use at least 20 GPa of water. If you are using this Miravis Prime in transplant water, you have to use at least 100 GPa. All right. Now, I'm going to show you some data, how this thing does Miravis Prime work or not. This is a trial conducted in 2023 where we looked at Miravis Prime as a banded application, pre-plant, and then we came back with a ProLine at transplant. This is my untreated check. Each and every plant was inoculated. We had close to 90% crop loss. But with this particular application, we saw a significant reduction in Fusarium wilt incidence. Now, there's one more program trial which we conducted. We used Miravis Prime as a soil 6-inch band and came back with ProLine right after transplanting. And then we also did one more shot of Miravis Prime 2 weeks after our Proline shot over the top. So more or less, numerically it did help, but statistically it's not significantly different from the first program trial. So long story short, if you want to use Mirabis Prime in a fusion wilt management, use it right before transplanting, use it anyway. The data which I have showed is more banded application. Then you come back with the Proline at transplant, and if needed, you can do one more shot of Mirabis Prime over the top after 2 weeks, 10 to 14 days. This is an example of our trial. This is all checks. Most of the plants are dead or been heavily infected. This is a Mirabis Prime and Proline program here. All right. Okay, so how can we better use Mirabis Prime? This is what we are recommending. Mirabis program can be used as a banded broadcast and pre-plant incorporated. Come back with a 5.7 ounce of Proline at transplanting. Then if needed, you can do one more shot of Mirabis Prime at a high volume spray 10 to 14 days after transplanting. Now, if you use Mirabis Prime as a soil use, only 2 applications are allowed in a season. Okay, if you don't have a fusion wilt problem, do not use Mirabis Prime as in soil. If you have a history of fusion wilt, then you have to do it, because you will be limited to use Mirabis Prime later in the season for other diseases. Well, the total amount allowed in cucurbits for Mirabis Prime is 30.8 fluid ounce. Moving on, we are going to talk about some cucurbit anthracnose work. So this project been funded recently by USD and NIFA, SCRI. Cucurbit anthracnose, again, is another disease from the last 4 or 5 years. Its trend has been increasing, and it is all across different crops, different cucurbit crops, but mainly severe particularly severe in cucumber and cantaloupe. But we saw some of the anthracnose outbreaks in melons too. This is an example of anthracnose outbreak we had in Berrien, Taft, and Colquitt County. See, this is the symptoms you see on the foliage, very typical symptoms of anthracnose. We also saw fruit symptoms. So we wanted to find that what is the reasoning of increasing trend of anthracnose in cucurbits. So we collected, with the help of our agents, we collected close to 170 isolates across different counties, and we ended up IDing them what they are. What we found, all the isolates, or most of the isolates, belong to Colototricum orbiculaire. Most of them are Colototricum orbiculaire, but it's a difference. So Colototricum orbiculaire from cucumber and cantaloupe, they actually separated phylogenetically compared to Colototricum orbiculaire from melons. So in simple sense, what we are seeing, same species, same genus and species of a causal agent, but there might be different races causing different diseases or different outbreaks in different crops. Now, what does it mean in terms of fungicide sensitivity? When we looked at the fungicide sensitivity, particularly azoxystrobin, which is a very important fungicide our grower use against anthracnose, we saw differential sensitivity of anthracnose against azoxystrobin. We saw high EC50 values, which means low sensitivity to azoxystrobin for anthracnose pathogen that were isolated from cucumber and cantaloupe compared to melons. So it means the anthracnose or Colototricum orbiculaire pathogen for cantaloupe and cucumber may or may not respond well to quadris or azoxystrobin, whereas in melons it may. So we demonstrated it in our fungicide trial. This is a fungicide trial done on cucumber, and we saw bunch of stuff works. For example, Proline, Topsin, they're highly to moderately effective against cucumber anthracnose, followed by Luna Experience, Marivon, Mirabis Prime, Aproviatop, and so forth. But look at this one, quadris. Quadris did not work in cucumber anthracnose. Okay, so keep this in mind. Quadris did not work. But when we did this trial in watermelon anthracnose, everything works. But look at quadris. Quadris still has some juice left in watermelon anthracnose. So we're looking at two different types, probably two different races of anthracnose affecting watermelon versus affecting cucumber and cantaloupe. In cucumber and cantaloupe, quadris may have some juice left or may not, but you have to rely on other heavy hitters. But in watermelon, quadris is still effective. So this is the gist of these two trials. All right, there's one more thing, there's one more twist which we found, that we know that Proline works great against anthracnose watermelon, irrespective of, anthracnose in cucurbits, irrespective of the host. We try to, this is the second year of trial, we try to tank mix Proline with macrothiol sulfur. It's a very micronized sulfur. We saw a boost in efficacy of Proline. So this is Proline alone. This is a total disease. This is Proline tank mix with macrothiol sulfur, 4 shots in a season. Look at the significant reduction in disease. So Proline, when tank mixed with macrothiol sulfur, gave a boost against anthracnose management. And this trial was done in cucumber. All right, Will Brown is already in our audience. He conducted a trial which is very, very important. So we identified fields in Brooks County that had an inherent population of Phytophthora capsicum. And you know, Phytophthora capsicum that causes Phytophthora blight in cucurbits, particularly bad in melons. So this particular trial was done in growers field when we looked at 4 different programs. We looked at, our first program includes starting with Presidio, Illumine, and Orondis rotation. My second program was Illumine, Orondis Ultra, and Presidio. And the third was 2 programs, but in each shots, we actually tank mixed K-Phyte. What we found overall, that whenever we use Presidio, Illumine, Orondis, or Illumine, Orondis, or Presidio, we had a significant reduction in the disease. K-Phyte, in one instance, in this particular instance, did not give us a boost, but for last 3 or 4 years it used to, but somehow this year it did not. But in this case, when you start Illumine with K-Phyte, or Orondis Ultra with K-Phyte, or Presidio with K-Phyte, it significantly reduced the fruit rot with Phytophthora. Now in this particular trial, since this trial was done in growers field, we cannot have a non-treated check. So, but I would say anything below 20% of fruit rot is acceptable. When you are dealing with a situation where you have a heavy infestation of Phytophthora. Going from Phytophthora to powdery mildew. So powdery mildew and squash. So this is an example of a trial. We looked at different products against powdery mildew. We have Lunaflex, Torac, Gatton, Proliva, Vivando, and Quintec. All these products are great, but 2 particular products, Gatton and Vivando, are our top hitters. It has been doing a great job in the last 3-4 years. Proliva also is hanging in there. It also has a good bit of efficacy against powdery mildew. Torac is actually insecticide against thrips, but it also has some use against powdery mildew. Lunaflex from Bayer, the new product, it also has a moderate level of efficacy. So based on my 3 or 4 years of trial, I ranked the powdery mildew fungicides in this order. We have Vivando and Gatton, our top hitters, followed by Proliva and Luna, all the Luna products and premixes. Proline also has some level of efficacy. Miravis Prime and Aprovia Top also have moderate level of efficacy against powdery mildew. Quintec has been losing its juice. So this is our ranking of squash powdery mildew. Moving on to another disease, and it's been a very important disease affecting our broccoli industry, not only in Georgia but also in the East Coast. The disease is Alternaria leaf blight and head rot. It is caused by a variety of Alternaria species, particularly Alternaria brassicicola. And I'm here to share you some of the story which we have learned over the years. This project was funded by USDA CRI in 2020. So this particular disease caused these foliar symptoms. You see these round concentric spots. And as the spots coalesce, you'll see the blighting symptoms. The pathogen can also disperse on the head of the broccoli and cause a head rot. So consumer cannot even sustain or accept one single spot on the head. If there is one single spot on the head, the entire lot can be rejected. So it's that sensitive. And if you go to any broccoli field infected with Alternaria, you will see Alternaria always starts from the bottom leaves, then moves up to the top. So the first question which we asked, that what is the causal agent of this particular pathogen, with this particular disease? Because this disease was well controlled since until 2015, but somehow something happened in 2015, 2016, we saw an increasing trend. So we teamed up with 4 different institutions in the East Coast, and then we started to work on this particular problem. What we saw that when we surveyed a bunch of commercial broccoli fields around the East Coast, including Georgia, over the 3 years, from 2020 to 2022, we found nearly 85% of the isolates which we collected from the broccoli field belong to Alternaria brassicicola. This is the major species that cause Alternaria leaf splat and head rot. We also found close to 15% in 15% of the instances, we found other species, including Alternaria japonica. All right, we wanted to see how aggressive these pathogens, these Alternaria brassicicola or japonica, on different brassica hosts. When we did a aggressive host pathogenicity and host aggressiveness test, we found that majority of the isolates we collected over the years, they are either highly aggressive or moderately aggressive on kale, collard, cabbage, and broccoli. What you're seeing here is a leaf disc assay, where you take a leaf disc of a crop, of a plant, and put an inoculum over here. And at the end of 4 or 5 days, you measure the diameter, longitudinal as well as transverse diameter of these lesions. So, long story short, whatever isolates we've been collecting over the years in the East Coast that cause Alternaria head rot, they are highly to moderately aggressive. Now, next question is how sensitive they are against quadrids or azoxystrobin, because azoxystrobin, again, has been utilized widely to control this disease in the East Coast and broccoli. We found nearly 1/4, so 1/4 of the isolates we collected, they're resistant to azoxystrobin at 10 ppm and 100 ppm. So 1/4 of the isolates we collected are already resistant. And the good news still is that 3/4 of the isolates are still sensitive to quadrids. So quadrids may or may not work in certain situations. Okay, that's with Alternaria brassicicola. But with Alternaria japonica, which is 15% of the isolates we collected, the story is a little different. Alternaria japonica are still sensitive to quadrids. This Alternaria japonica growing, you can see that they could not grow in a fungicide amended plate here, but this is a control, this is a non-amended plate. Close to 93% of the isolates we collected of japonicas, they are still sensitive. So if you have japonica, quadrids may work. That's the reason in some instances quadrids work in the field, and in some instances it doesn't, because of the presence of either japonica or sensitive Alternaria brassicicola isolates. So, next question, how these things are introducing in our system, how they're coming in. So we have this hypothesis. We said, can Alternaria species be introduced via commercial broccoli seedlots? Or can isolates, and the second question we asked, can the isolates with reduced sensitivity to fungicides be introduced through these commercial seedlots? This project was done by my postdoc, Dr. Navjot Kaur, where what she did, she collected 100 seed lots, commercial seeds. She bought 100 commercial seed lots from 2 different varieties. So we have 200 seed lots. And we looked at the presence and absence of the pathogen, Alternaria, using seedling grow-out assay. So this is seedling grow-out assay. We take these commercial seeds, we grow them out, and at the end of 14 to 15 days, you will see these seedling transmission of the pathogen here. So we found here close to 1/3 of the isolates, 1/3 of the seed packets or commercial lots which are circulating, which we sampled, had Alternaria. They already been contaminated with Alternaria. So cultivar 1, 31%, cultivar 2, 28%. So that's not a great news. So they already have been contaminated. Next question is, are those isolates we are isolating from those commercial seed lots are highly aggressive, are pathogenic? First question is, are they pathogenic on broccoli? And second question, are they aggressive on broccoli? We found 94% of the isolates are highly aggressive and from cultivar 1, and 87% of the isolates are highly aggressive from cultivar 2. So close to 133 isolates. You're talking about 90% of the isolates are already pathogenic on broccoli. So the gist is, in our commercial lots, there's a possibility some of the highly pathogenic Alternaria isolates be circulating through the system. Third question is, are those isolates sensitive to quadrids or fungicides? We found the 15% of the Alternaria brassicicola isolates from the seeds, commercial seeds, they're already resistant to quadrids. So this is at 1 ppm, this is at 10 ppm, and this is 100 ppm. They can see they could still germinate here. So that's not a great news. But when we I was talking about the problem, but I'm also giving a solution here. We looked at all these different seed treatments which can use to reduce the seed transmission of Alternaria. This is a non-seed treated control where each and every plant, each and every seed transmitted the pathogen, you can see here. But when we use Endura, the disease transmission was reduced from 100% to 18%. When we use Miravis, pure Miravis, it was reduced further from 100% to 8%. It's a great product. And then Captain and Theorem are the commonly used seed treatments. They did not a great, decent job. They did reduce from 100% to 60%, but it's not acceptable reduction. But the good thing is that we have two fungicides that can potentially be utilized as a seed treatments in future that can reduce your seedling transmission of Alternaria brassicicola. So what did we learn? We learned the Alternaria brassicicola. Majority of the major species we are finding is the major species we are finding that cause Alternaria head blight is Alternaria brassicicola. Second, if majority of them are highly pathogenic and highly aggressive on broccoli. Third, close to 15% of them are already resistant to quadris. And fourth, we already have some potential seed treatment that can reduce the seedling transmission. Moving on to fungicide option, what can we do? So this block of fungicides did a decent job in reducing the head rot. So this is a non-treated check, we're close to have 100% head rot, where Quadristop, Quadris, Inspire Super, Miravis Prime, Luna Sensation, Preoxide, and Top Guard EQ, they significantly reduced the head rot incidence. I'll show you some example here. This is my check. Everything is almost decimated. This is my Quadristop. This is Fontelis. This is Luna Sensation. Some of the example close up. So this is a check. You can see it did not even form a head here. Fontel is not too great, but this is Luna Sensation. Quadrista was in the middle. Okay, what about the software products? So we looked at the list of the different software products. Among the software products, the only one product that works on Alternaria leaf blight and head rot, it's OSO. And it's been quite consistent. The data which I showed is also been repeated by 4 different states. And we also have comparable results. So OS is the only product that works again, Alternaria head blight and head blight. It was able to reduce the disease incidence from 90% to 36%. But in organics, this is the best you can get. Okay. But what about the other software products like Lifeguard, CoSat 3000, HAL or Thea? No, they did not. All right, moving on to Alternaria. So there's one more thing that actually changed, that actually made us think that how to better use our fungicide against broccoli and in Alternaria. So this is an example. I'll show how the biology is important. Biology of infection is important to modify your spray schedule. So this trial was done, this particular work was done by my postdoc, Dr. Sunil, but he showed that older leaves, which are the bottom leaves, are highly susceptible to Alternaria infection compared to the younger leaves. So these are older leaves infection, these are younger leaf infection. You can see a difference. If infection starts at point 0 or at time 0, you will see infection would be highly aggressive on the older leaves, but less aggressive or no infection on the younger leaves. What's the reason? We found a nice correlation, nice regression with the high disease incidence with the high wax layer. Okay, so, high disease incidence with the low wax layer. So lower leaves had no wax. Older leaves do not have any wax. As a result, we see a lot of infection, whereas upper leaves do have wax and we see a less disease. Now, if you look at our spray program, especially in Georgia's broccoli spray program, we start with Bravo, 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 and then once it starts hitting, we switch to heavy hitters. Okay, now Bravo cannot give you a guarantee to control Alternaria from the older leaves. But we wanted to see, can we switch our fungicide program in such a way that we start with systemics, then go with Bravos, and then switch back to systemics later. So there are 2 programs we tested. One program was our traditional program. We start with Bravo, Bravo, Bravo until headset. Then we switch back to Luna Sensation, Miravis Prime, and all our heavy hitters. And another program based on the biology that the lower leaves will not have a wax layer, so go ahead and protect them with systemics. So we started with our systemics, our heavy hitters, Luna, Sensation, Miravis Prime, Inspire Super, and then we slowly went to the Bravo, 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 and then again switched back to Luna Sensation. Look at the difference. Just mere switching of these fungicides when we do things, we have a significant reduction of a disease from our traditional program compared to our newer modified program. And this information was based on the biology of the infection. All right, all this information is already in Alt Control Delete. This is a web page we have designed, and we have all the reports and all the fungicide data and everything here. If you want to, you can check it out. All right. Last but not the least, we cannot conclude a fungicide trial, a fungicide talk without talking about onions. So onion is one of our biggest crops, and one of the most important disease and most frightening disease we see in onions is downy mildew. Luckily, it doesn't occur every year. It's highly sporadic, and doing an onion downy mildew is very difficult because it doesn't occur every year. So last year, somehow it occurred in Vidalia, and we have a team of agents who jumped on this opportunity, and we conducted a trial. So this is how downy mildew looks, and if this particular disease is uncontrolled, is not controlled with a fungicide, then within 3 to 4 days, your whole crop can be decimated. It's that bad. So downy mildew was moderate, did not cause much considerable losses, but it was there. That provided us opportunity to look at some of the products. These are the products and the programs we looked at. For example, we looked at Redeemil Gold Copper, we looked at Bravo and Zampro tank mix, we looked at Omega Zampro tank mix, and different tank mixes and so forth. The thing that did not work is Bravo and K5 tank mix. It was not, it was significantly different from the non-treated check, but there's a group of fungicide and programs that did have some level of efficacy against downy mildew. So Redeemil Gold Copper, Bravo and Zampro, and Omega and Zampro, this program worked really well. So based on our 3 or 4 years of data, these are the rankings we have made. We have for downy mildew in onions. Nothing is great, but we start with some of the moderate products like Omega 500, Redeemil Gold Copper, Orandis Ultra, and Zampro. They are moderate products. Bravo also has some level of efficacy, moderate to low. So we recommend the Bravo should be used as a tank mix partner with these heavy hitters. Phosphite also have a level of efficacy. If you want to use it in a rotation or as a tank mix partner. The things that don't have efficacy is Previgar Flex, Ranman, and Revus. Reason when we did trial a couple of years, 3-4 years ago, it did not give a great result. But growers did try Reason last year, and they say that they mentioned that it has some level, still have some level of juice left. So Reason will be reevaluated again if downy mildew appears. Well, with this, I'd like to acknowledge my team of people. I could not have done and achieved whatever we have because without them. So, and also, I'd like to acknowledge everyone, funding agency, Georgia Vegetable Commission, GDAs, and USDA, NIFA, and so forth. So with this, I'd like to take questions, and thank you.
All right, does anybody have any questions for Dr. Besh?
Do you have any questions? Yeah.
Yes, so in your cucumber efficacy trial and your squash powdery mildew, how many applications were applied?
So for powdery mildew trial, there was 4 applications. 4, yeah. And cucumber anthracnose trial, there were 4 applications. Yeah, 7 to 10 day interval. Yes.
On the fusarium research, would you suspect that an injection of Miravis Prime through the drip would be just as good as the other banded treatments under the plastic?
That's a good question. Most of my research is based on banded. Okay, there's some instances where I used drip, and I saw some variable results, but I would say banded application is the best. It has been consistent in my trial. Yes.
On your powdering, are you using a fungicide prior to seeing infection?
Yes, yes. Some of the products do have a curative activity, some of the products have preventative activity. So fungicides we recommend, not in order to reduce the chances of fungicide resistance development, we always want our fungicide to be applied early. But if you see a powdery mildew, go ahead with the Vivando. And
At what point are you putting that in your rotation?
Right after fruit set. Once you have fruit and the flower, you go with the fungicide. If there are no further questions, I'll be around. If you have other questions, you can ask me, but I'm turning over to Dr. Stormy Sparks.
All right, thank you, Dr. Besh. Up next, we'll have Dr. Stormy Sparks giving an insecticide update.
All right, let's jump right into it. A little bit on insecticides. Start with, I know some people have been hearing about what's going on with Laura's ban. Hopefully you understand it, because I don't. But EPA people to catch up to us today and let us know. It's in the courts again. If we get it back, which I'll be honest with you, I think is doubtful. If we get it back, it'll go right back into the courts, I have no doubt. But it's in there right now. We'll talk a little bit about that. If we get it back, it's going to, I think, is greatly also going to depend on will industry support it, which I would highly doubt as well. We'll talk about that. And then what crops are likely to be there. What happened with it, if you're not familiar with it, it went to one court, 2 years ago now, probably. And the court said, you've been dealing with this a long time. They told EPA, you have to either say it's safe or eliminate it. EPA couldn't say all uses were safe, so the court said, well, you've got to eliminate it, and that's how we lost it. All right, the newest court came in and said, no, this is not a black and white issue, it's gray, and EPA can work in those gray areas. Those uses that you have identified as being safe, you can maintain. And then you lose the other uses. So that's where the potential of it coming back is coming from. If you read the court document, they specify uses that were determined safe. Now, hopefully it's not an all-inclusive list, because none of our uses are on that list. So if we get it back, whether or not we'll get it back in any vegetables is questionable. All right, but that's where it stands right now. The other big thing you've got to ask is who in the world, what company is going to bring it back knowing it's going to go right back into the courts? So even if EPA decides, yes, we have these uses are safe, you're allowed to use them. The people I've talked with at Corteva and at least one of the generic companies that has a chlorpyrifos have all said, no, we're not going to do that. So it's in the courts. It'll be interesting to see what happens, but looking at the tea leaves, I don't think we're going to see it back. And if we do, it's going to be very limited in where we can use it. What's in the pipeline? Same thing's going on with those. We talked about these same two last year because they were in the pipeline last year, and they're still in the pipeline. They're the newest things, the nearest things we're going to have. We'll talk a little bit about Nerisma, the top one there from BASF, broflanilide. Will apparently never have any foliar uses, but it does have some soil uses now that you might want to consider. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then the closest one is ISM 555, the planazoline from Syngenta, is registered in some other countries. When I talked to them last week or week before, they said hopefully we'll get some registrations here late 2024, late this year, which usually means maybe next year. All right, but that's where we're at right now, and it's got to go through all the hoops that everything, all these new registrations. You're going to hear a lot about the Endangered Species Act later. They've got to jump through all those hoops as well. How will they help us? First of all, Nerisma does have some labels. Right now it's on corn and tuberous corn vegetables, which basically for us is in vegetable world is sweet corn and potatoes, including sweet potatoes. Corn label is in furrow. We're used to doing that kind of thing. We've got a lot of options in corn, so it's not as important for us there. On sweet potatoes, where we lost Lorsban, this is a possible replacement for Lorsban. It's got, if you look at the company data, it's got good efficacy on wireworms. We've got a little bit of data from Georgia on wireworms as well. The trick with this is going to be is it's an in-furrow application. If you look at the bottom down here, an in-furrow application at time of planting only. In-furrow is a 5 to 7 inch wide spray. I don't know anybody that does that. 5 to 7 inch wide spray, and it must be covered immediately. So it's going to be a little tricky how to figure out how to put it out, I think. I'll show you what we did. I did some work with it this last year. We looked at the high rate and the low rate, in-furrow, pre-plant, and then we looked at that with and without a lay-by with bifenthrin and compared it to a straight bifenthrin program. The way I did it, we started out with a flatbed. We made a run through with a rolling cultivator. It kind of leaves a V shape in there. We sprayed that, then came back with 3 more passes with the rolling cultivator to bed it up. So we had that 5 to 7 inch band and then covered it fairly immediately. Unfortunately, this is one of the things you deal with soil insects. We had very low pest pressure, so we didn't get a lot of differences. I think we figured out one way to put it out. Hopefully it'll be efficacious, but we didn't get a lot of difference in my test. David Riley worked with this 2019, 2020. He also looked at a kind of a unique way of applying it. They developed these kind of, wing-shaped sweeps, one on each side of the row. And if you look at that, there's a boom down in the middle of that. They're putting that down in the ground, kind of like flying 4 inches below the ground and spraying that product directly under the ground. Kind of a unique way of doing it. They got some fairly good data. They looked at a lot of different things, putting everything out that way. They've got chlorpyrifos in there, the broflanilide, or Nerisma, and the ISM 555. Don't worry about the data, just look at the boxes. These first 2 columns are where they reduced damage. These last 2 columns are where they increased yields. And you can't see that, but I'll tell you these are broflanilide, ISM 555, ISM 555, and broflanilide. So they've got some efficacy on wireworms. It looks fairly good. If you're growing sweet potatoes, you know, this may not be something you jump into wholeheartedly, but I'd take a look at it and see what it does for you. ISM 555, assuming we get that registered, assuming we can make foliar applications, I think it's going to help us in a lot of different areas. It's a fairly broad spectrum insecticide. It's fairly good on thrips. Nothing is great on thrips, but I'm not going to show you any thrips data, but it's good on thrips. This is pepper weevil. And you go over here and look at these last 2 sets. These are ISM 555 treatments, and that's mortality at different times after exposure in a bioassay. And you see that it worked very well, whereas Vidate's right next to it. So Vidate's kind of our standard right now, our best product for pepper weevil. ISM 555 is comparable. So if nothing else, it'll give us a good rotation partner. If we can't spray it during bloom, we can at least use it to clean up the crop prior to bloom and then come back in with Vidate. So we're going to have, depending on how it's labeled, we'll have to figure out how to use it, but it'll help us there. Where I'm really excited about it, because I hope it makes my life a lot easier, is diamondback moth. I've done a number of trials with diamondback moth and it's looked pretty good. This particular trial I did last spring. Pest pressure, that top line, the red is the check. That's number per 5 plants, so it wasn't real heavy pest pressure compared to what we can have, but it was decent for a test. Look at a number of different things. First of all, this is Zentari. The bottom line is Zentari at a pound. This is 2 applications, one before this first sampling date, one before the second one. Zentari at a pound. The other line is Zentari at a ½ a pound plus spear lep. I've done a lot of work with spear lep. If it's working for you, great. In my system, I have not been able to make it work well. I'd love for it to work well. It's a different mode of action. It'd give us a good resistance management tool, but in general, I get about as good a control with a pound of BT as I do with that mixture, if not a little better. This is Lepigen. This is the virus that's been selected specifically for diamondback moth. The top blue line is Lepigen alone. It is not a standalone product. Everybody that works with it knows that. Viruses tend to be very slow, so you're not going to get a sudden knockdown of the pest. Where we're looking at trying to figure out to use it, what we think we can do is use it in combination with synthetic products. We know we have resistance problems, so if you spray something, Radiant, Proclaim, whatever, in this case we use Proclaim, if you spray that alone, you get 60–80% control. We're hoping that the Lepigen will help with those 20–40% that are surviving the synthetic product. And that's what we're kind of looking at here. Again, this is 2 applications. This is Proclaim alone. You can see that it starts building back up towards the end. Where we put the Lepigen with it, it's dropping back down at the end. Now, we've got a lot of work to do with this yet to see if this is going to be a consistent thing, but that's kind of where we're looking at right now, where it might fit as we get it in the system. Lepigen hopefully gets into the caterpillars. It causes mortality. The virus is released, so it maintains itself in the population. So we're going to look at, can we get it in there early and maybe help with the synthetic products as far as resistance management and everything else. Then this last slide on this test, or we'll dive back on this test. First of all, I want to point out Ryman. Ryman's not one that we do a lot of work with because it's kind of hard to deal with in bioassays because it's slow. We had severe widespread resistance to Ryman several years ago. We put it in a test last year, and you can see it looked fairly good. Now, I will warn you, anything that we get back because we haven't used it in a while is very easy to reselect for resistance. I'll give you the best example of that. Several years ago, I did a test in a farm, and Lanate was the best product in the test. They had not used it for a couple of years because of worker safety concerns. I said, all right, it's the best thing you got. Spray it once, maybe twice. How many times they spray it? 4. Did a test in that field, and Lanate was the worst product in the test. If you've had resistance, it's easy to recreate it. So if you're going to get back in with Ryman, Diamond, make a rotation. The real exciting thing is that bottom line. That's the ISM 555. I've done a number of tests on diamondback moth with it, and it's consistently looked like that. And if you'll remember, everything we've ever registered for diamondback moth has looked like that when we register it. All right, it doesn't last long if you hammer away. So make sure if we get it, we rotate so we can maintain susceptibility. And this is just imported cabbage worm, same test. And again, ISM 555 across the bottom. It's fairly broad spectrum product. I think it'll help us in a lot of areas if we get it registered. I want to remind everybody that we have detected resistance in beet armyworm in Georgia to the diamide insecticides. All right, this is Corrigan and Exarel. You can see a lot of survival where we should have them all dead. Got pretty good activity at Radiant. Now this, we don't know how widespread it is. We didn't have a lot of beet armyworm problems this year. I'm not aware of any real severe control issues. But the bottom line on all of this is if you've got beet armyworm and you spray a group 28 insecticide and it does not work, don't go out there and spray it again. You're just maintaining, people do it. You think, well, it might have rained 4 hours after I sprayed. I might have had some coverage issues. Just assume that you might have some resistance and rotate products, which you should be doing anyway. We're still keeping an eye on this thrips from Florida. Thrips parvospinus has become apparently a consistent problem for them in South Florida. We have detected it in Georgia. It's got a very wide host range. Primarily, we're watching out for damage on peppers and eggplant. Primarily peppers, you get this virus-like symptom, or it might look like broad mite, but you can't find broad mite. Then you might have thrips parvospinus. It's a small thrips. If you're looking for it, it's very easy to overlook. It's probably half to two-thirds the size of the thrips you're used to seeing. So it's relatively small. The big difference is on the females, instead of being uniformly tan or uniformly black like most of our thrips are, the head and thorax is kind of straw-colored, the abdomen is black, and the wings are actually kind of, the part over the thorax is light, part over the abdomen is dark. And I don't know of anything that you're likely to see that you would confuse with it. So if you see that, let us know. It has been detected in Georgia, but it has only been detected on ornamental plants in stores. So it undoubtedly has been purchased and moved out of those stores into the home environment, but we're not aware of anything established in Georgia at this point, but we're keeping an eye on it. Then if you learn anything today, this is one you need to be aware of, particularly if you grow sweet corn. If you're not familiar with this, the Heliothine adult vial test, this is something that was developed at Texas A&M back in the late 80s. Dr. Bill Platt started doing this. You take a scintillation vial, this is for pyrethroid resistance. You treat that vial, you collect adults, you put them in there, you look at it 24 hours, and you look at the survival. This is old data, but it's important. The bottom line is bollworm, which is corn earworm, at 5 micrograms per vial. The top line is budworm at 10 micrograms per vial. Bollworm's always been more susceptible, but you see it was even climbing a little bit back then. At 10 micrograms per vial, back in about early 90s, that resistance got up to about 30 to 40% survival. We have not used pyrethroids on budworm since the early 90s. They just don't work anymore when you get to that level of resistance. Philip Roberts has been doing this for a couple of decades in South Georgia. This is just corn earworm. The blue line is the 5 microgram per vial. You'll see that this jumped up into the 30s and 40s at 5 micrograms per vial. Anybody know what happened right here? You got an obvious shift right there. Anybody been to Philip's talk? 2013 was the last year that methylparathion was available for spraying stink bugs in field corn. All those applications switched over to the pyrethroids. Most of the corn earworm population in Georgia goes through field corn in the spring before it goes to the sweet corn in the fall. They're getting sprayed with pyrethroids in that field corn, and we're increasing resistance. Then we just continue that in vegetables. That's the 5. This is the 10 micrograms per vial. 35% last year. Had some individual dates where it was over 50% survival. And if you remember the budworm data, when you get up in that 30% range, pyrethroids quit working. All right, so that's a concern. Because of that, I also did a bioassay. Now I've been doing trials with sweet corn for several years, looking at rotations in different products. I was going to do one this year. This is the day after the hurricane, the day I was supposed to start spraying. Obviously wasn't going to do that, but what we did is we went in and we collected, later in the season, collected larvae out of that corn. Corn earworm, we put them on treated leaflets of soybean and then looked at mortality. What we looked at was Warrior at 1.92 fluid ounces, lanated to 1.5 pints, and Radiant at 6 fluid ounces. Mix it up as if you're spraying 100 gallons per acre, dip the leaf. So that's really actually a fairly high exposure rate. We did the 1x rate, we did half of that, and we did a 2x rate. All right, and if you look at here, we'll start over here on your right. Radiant at a half, 1x, 2x, pretty good mortality. We had 1 survive at the half rate. Lanate at the half, 1x, 2x, again, fairly good mortality. If you look at Warrior, the half rate, the 1x rate, and the 2x rate, we had a lot of survival. So I don't think there's any question that we've got some resistance. The other thing, if you look at it, it's fairly level across there. There's not a big rate response. So going with the higher rate, this is a really high rate, didn't increase mortality that much. That tells me that about 50% of that population is resistant, and that resistance is strong. It's not a weak resistance, it's a very strong resistance. This is a major concern for sweet corn, because even if you switch over to, say, a Radiant, you're limited on applications on all these newer products. You're going from $3 to $5 an acre to $20 to $30 an acre. And even if you go to these products that have better efficacy, longer residual, in sweet corn system, you still have to spray them daily for ear protection. And you can't, I don't see how you're going to afford to do that at $20 to $30 an acre. So it's a big thing there. In other vegetables where the caterpillars are exposed and you can get by with 1 or 2 applications, it's not as big a deal. But sweet corn, this is going to be a major issue. Sweet corn, again, we continue to look at some of the BT technology just to see what's going on. We don't use it, we don't grow it, but it's interesting. This is the conventional variety. The red is unmarketable ears. Almost everything unmarketable. Attribute is the single gene, single cryoprotein, about 50% controlled. Performance series is the stacked cryoprotein. It's got 2 cryoproteins in there. Looks very similar to the single cryoprotein at this point. Where we still get very good control, this is attribute 2 and attribute plus. Those have a cryoprotein and a VIP protein, the vegetative insecticide protein in there. Excellent control. So if you're, growing roadside market or whatnot, and you're able to use that technology, it gives you excellent control. I will tell you that, in my opinion, the varieties that's in still are not the best eating varieties. They're not as sweet as a lot of these other improved varieties. Last thing I want to touch on, Dr. Amol Nankar is in the back of the room. He is our new breeder in Tifton. All right, he's starting a new program. This is your chance to have input on his program and tell him what you need him to do. You've got surveys in the room. They're on a white sheet. Please fill those out and turn them in up here or to Amol and help guide his program. Any questions?
Any questions for Dr. Sparks?
Did you see an uptick in threats after the hurricane in August?
I don't recall that. We had an uptick in whiteflies, but I don't remember a big uptick in thrips, no. It could happen. I mean, they could get blown in the same as whiteflies or anything else. But I would say I was surprised that we didn't have a crash in the whitefly population with the amount of rain we have. We normally anticipate very little immature mortality, but a lot of adult mortality, and we just didn't see that this time, which was quite surprising. They came in late this year. You can go ahead. But they came in strong when they came in.
All right, thank you, Dr. Sparks. Up next, we'll have Jake Lee. Jake is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Pesticide Programs within the EPA's Office of Chemical Safety and Pollution Prevention, where he works on a wide variety of pesticide issues. One of Jake's priorities is to help the EPA achieve its endangered species protection goals related to pesticide decisions. Jake has also represented the regulated community as an environmental lawyer in private practice. Jake strives to bring his insight from working with the private sector and environmental groups to find a practical, fair, efficient, and durable solution to how the EPA regulates pesticide and other chemicals.
Okay, well, good morning, everyone. As noted earlier, I'm Jake Lee. I work at EPA's pesticide office, so I help oversee pesticide policy at EPA. And that includes, all of the things that you've been hearing for the last half hour about pesticides. I want to focus on something in particular that's probably our biggest legal issue in the pesticide office, and one that really can affect the availability of pesticides in the future for all of you if we don't get this right and we don't work together on this, which is that we have not been complying with the Endangered Species Act, meaning properly protecting endangered species from pesticide use basically since the beginning of our agency. So we have registered almost every single pesticide that's out there without properly evaluating its impacts on endangered species and without offering enough protections for endangered species. We have been sued for many years over the failure to comply with the Endangered Species Act. We've been losing almost every single one of those lawsuits. And those court cases have now gotten to the point where there is some real risk of pesticides being pulled off the market. In fact, that just happened last December. So that's why I've been asked to come talk to you about this issue. It's one that we really want to make you all aware of. I think there are solutions here, but there are solutions that really require the engagement of the pesticide user community, of the environmental groups that have been suing us for a number of years, of other federal agencies, and of congressional offices. So everyone has to be part of this solution. So I want to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to leave some time at the end for questions. So I really would prefer for this to be somewhat engaging and back and forth discussion. I actually have one of my colleagues here, Jan Matusko, who's sitting over there. She oversees the science division that does the Endangered Species Act assessments. So she and I are going to tag team, and you can feel free to ask us, policy and science questions. I also want to thank Dr. Stanley Culpepper. I don't know where he is. He's probably sitting somewhere. There he is. Okay, for actually inviting me here. He's a really great guy and a really good collaborator on all of this work, really focused on trying to find some practical solutions for all of you and for the fact that we have to comply with the law. And if we don't, it's game over on all of this stuff. Okay, so I want to give you a really brief background because I know many of you are probably not familiar with what this problem is in the first place and how we got into this enormous mess. So just for the basics, the Endangered Species Act is a federal law. It actually turned 50 last December. And there are a number of requirements, but the one that really applies here is that all federal agencies, including EPA, has to make sure that all of our decisions, all of our actions, whenever we give money to someone, complies with the Endangered Species Act. And by compliance, it basically means that we cannot jeopardize the existence of any of the roughly 1,600 federally protected endangered species in the US. So what does jeopardize mean? It basically means that an endangered species is already one that's sort of at risk of extinction, right? We can make the risk of extinction even greater through the actions that we cause. So you might be familiar in the past with like a bridge project or a highway project, right, that goes through an endangered species habitat. Well, that's the type of action that the Endangered Species Act says, stop, let's look at the impacts on endangered species, and there are impacts. You have to find ways to reduce those impacts and try to offset them through other ways, right? So that's the basic requirement. We can't make things worse for endangered species through our actions. Endangered species also have habitat that's actually protected. It's called critical habitat. These are the habitats that are needed for those endangered species to recover and eventually be removed from the Endangered Species Act. And then finally, all federal agencies like EPA have to consult with the federal wildlife agencies to ensure that we're not creating jeopardy and we're not destroying the critical habitat. So what are those two agencies and how does it apply to pesticides here? What this basically means is that every time EPA registers a new pesticide, every time we register a new use of an existing pesticide, every time we reevaluate an existing pesticide to determine whether we should continue the registration, right? That's every 15 years we have this requirement to reevaluate all pesticides on the market. We triggered the Endangered Species Act. And the ESA basically says, you can't jeopardize species, you can't destroy critical habitat. And the only way for us to know whether any of those is true is that we have to consult with the US Fish and Wildlife Service or the National Marine Fisheries Service. US Fish and Wildlife Service oversees the protections for all the terrestrial species you can think of in the US, manatees, wolves, lots of endangered plants, lots of endangered fish. And then the NOAA Fisheries oversees protection for salmon. So in the Pacific Northwest, there's a lot of endangered salmon. And we need to ensure that the use of pesticides doesn't cause these salmons to go extinct. So that's the process, right, for us to consult with these wildlife agencies. And we have to do so for all the uses of a pesticide that's actually being registered. So it's a tremendous amount of work, right? So just think about it this way. Currently, 1,600 endangered species in the US. We have all of these pesticide active ingredients, and we have all of these uses for each of these pesticide active ingredients. So it's sort of no wonder we haven't actually complied with the Endangered Species Act in 40 years. It's a really hard technical problem to figure out. We really don't have the resources to do this work in full, and the agency has in the past basically says, put their hands up and said, we don't know what to do, so we're just going to continue approving pesticides until we get dinged. Well, that's where the court cases come in. This court case was actually from middle of December last year, and it struck down our approval of streptomycin as a citrus pesticide because of our failure to comply with the Endangered Species Act. And not only did it strike down the decision, it actually vacated the decision as well. And that basically means that in a time it's going to take us to comply with the Endangered Species Act, streptomycin has been essentially, it's going to be pulled off the shelf for citrus. So this is very real now. This is not a hypothetical sort of situation of compliance. This is stuff where, it sets a precedent also for other new use registrations as well. So this is one of the first times we're actually seeing a vacatur by a court, meaning essentially telling us to pull it off the shelf because of the failure to comply with the Endangered Species Act. In 2021 is another example of aldicarb use in citrus in Florida, where a federal court also struck it down because of the failure to comply with the Endangered Species Act. These court opinions, if you read them, are very clear. There's no ambiguity. The courts have very much lost patience with EPA. And these are just 3 other cases from just the last year and a half where we've been struck down on the failure to comply with the Endangered Species Act. This first court case, I'll just read it to you because it's actually the first sentence of the whole court decision. It's deja vu all over again. EPA comes before this court once more because of its failure to abide by the law. That's the Endangered Species Act. And EPA cannot flout the will of Congress and of the people just because it thinks it's too busy or understaffed. In other words, what the court is saying is that just because we don't have enough money, just because we don't have a process to do all of this work, that's not an excuse for violating the law, right? And that's very consistent with other court cases. Because the fact that Congress has not been funding us enough to do all of this work is almost never an excuse for violating the law. And so basically every other court decision we've been getting in the last year and a half is consistent with all of this. And what it really means is that this is an existential threat to the pesticide program, to the continued registration of a lot of pesticides, unless we figure out the solution to all of this. So what we started doing is about 3 years ago, at the start of this administration, we finally took this Endangered Species Act obligation very seriously. And we basically implemented a number of policies to try to get us back on track. We're not going to solve this entire problem overnight. We're not going to dig out of a 40-year debacle, in 2 to 3 years. But we can finally set a path to saying that we eventually want to come into full compliance so that the pesticides you all use are 100% legally compliant, that there's not a risk of it being pulled off the shelf because of a very, very obvious legal defect, which is the failure to comply with the ESA. So what we did is in April of 2022, we released this work plan that's basically the roadmap to success, right? It basically says how we eventually get from our current state, which is non-compliance for most of these pesticides, to a state of full compliance. It's going to take a number of years, but we've identified how we're going to get there. One of the most important things, and this is what I want to focus on for the rest of my talk, is we need to begin adopting protections for endangered species earlier in this FIFRA, that's the pesticide law registration process. We can't wait for the entire Endangered Species Act process to play out before we begin protecting some of these species. The reason is that if we wait for the whole ESA process to play out, and that's currently 4 to 12 years per pesticide active ingredient. You already read the court cases earlier. They are not going to give us time. They're not going to wait till the year 2070 for EPA to say, hey, give us 50 years, we'll eventually figure this one out. So we need to start adopting some protections for endangered species, even if they don't get us all the way across the finish line, even if they're not full compliance with the ESA yet. And so that's what we've been doing. And you might be wondering, well, what are these early protections, right? What are they actually looking like? What we're hoping is that these early protections are fairly common sense types of measures that maybe many of you already implement today to reduce pesticide drift and reduce pesticide runoff off of the field. Every grower I've met doesn't want to waste pesticides, right? They're really expensive. So I think what we're trying to adopt here are measures that are consistent with saving money, good stewardship practices. And so we break down these early protections into 2 categories. The first one is reducing pesticide spray drift, right? That's really important. We don't want pesticides drifting off into endangered species habitat and killing those endangered species, because right now that's a violation of the law. That's not an approved, killing of the endangered species or destruction of that habitat. So the measures that we've been contemplating and that we're offering out there are things like larger droplet sizes to ensure that those droplets drop to the ground faster. Spray restrictions based on wind speed. So if the wind speed is past a certain speed, then no spraying or reductions in sprayings. Limits on the height of sprayers, buffers for sensitive habitat, and we're also trying a new thing, which is wind directional buffers. So buffers based on the direction of wind. That way we can actually minimize the number of instances where you all have to adopt spray drift restrictions. So those are just a few examples of the types of protections based on spray drift. Another really important one, and this is newer for us, we really haven't done much of this in the agency's history, is trying to reduce pesticide runoff and from erosion. So examples could be no applications before 48 hours of a big storm event. And there are options to reduce runoff, like vegetative filter strips, cover crops, riparian buffers, retention ponds, strip cropping, mulching, right? I'm hoping some of these practices are familiar to all of you because, again, these are good practices that are not specific to endangered species, right? These are really about how do we reduce pesticide movement off of a field to begin with. And those measures may not have been adopted consistently in the past. They certainly weren't on our pesticide labels consistently. And what I'm basically saying is that moving forward, we need to start putting some of these measures on labels, because unless we do so, we're going to get sued and we are going to lose those lawsuits because we have no protections in place for endangered species. Another example would be some pollinator language that we have out there to protect pollinators that may also help protect some endangered species. So I want to talk about what these new protections look like. How do they actually get communicated to all of you? Well, there's two ways I want to flag. The first way is what you've traditionally seen, right, on the pesticide label. It could be, on the label, sort of physical label itself. It could be, a 150-page label where, there are now new sections with some of these mitigation options I've talked about. So that's all the label. The new thing, although it's not new, we've actually had this for a number of years, but we're using it more and more, is something called Bulletins Live 2, or we just call it BLT shorthand. So this is an online complement to the physical label, where if there are restrictions specific to endangered species in specific parts of a county, we will post these online. And a user needs to go check the bulletins live to see if there are restrictions on top of those on the physical label. So you may be asking, why do we have this sort of two-part system? Why not just put everything on the label itself and be done with it? The reason is that we are actually trying to narrow the protections and the restrictions as much as possible, only to those areas where the endangered species is found, right? And remember what I said earlier, there are 1,600 endangered species in the US. So we're not gonna fit all of that information on a physical label, right? A physical label is already oftentimes hundreds of pages long. We're not gonna make it 3,000 pages long, right? So what we wanna do is take advantage of the internet and take advantage of the fact that online we can display, right, the specific areas where we think protections are needed for endangered species, and then just as importantly, those areas where the protections are not needed. We can also reflect timing restrictions. So what times of the year do we actually think endangered species protections are needed? Again, this is all done to really limit the regulatory impact of the endangered species restrictions to only those parts of the county where an endangered species occurs. Otherwise, imagine what would happen. We would list the entire county and say that if you're in this county, you have to adopt all of these restrictions. End of story, right? And in those cases, we know the endangered species probably isn't even in 90% of the county, but unless we can tell you where in that county that species in, you're gonna have, everyone in the county is gonna have to adopt those restrictions. So that's why Bulletins Live 2 is really, really important moving forward. It's something that I think most of you are probably not familiar with, maybe you haven't even heard, but part of what I want to do is to raise awareness about this because this is gonna be part of the label more and more moving forward. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is how do we start applying these early protections for some species? Because again, we can't do it for everything, right? We can't do it for all 1,600 species all at once, for all pesticides all at once. So we have to make some incremental progress. So I want to talk about a few initiatives that we released last year and that we'll be releasing this year to start showing how we're adopting some protections. The first one I want to flag is something called the Vulnerable Species Project. And through this, we identified roughly 27 endangered species throughout the United States that we thought were particularly vulnerable to pesticide impacts. So these are not species where, you know, they can be sprayed with pesticides, no big deal, right? These are species that we think might be put into jeopardy because of pesticide use. And so we want to be proactive in getting ahead of some of the impacts to these species, in part so that we can provide more legal certainty to all of you when you use pesticides that may affect these species. So we put out a whole draft plan for how to protect these 27 species. And what we'll be doing by September of this year is providing an update on how we're going to sort of move forward with protections for those 27 species. We're reevaluating whether every one of those species should still belong in this pilot. And we're actually under a court obligation to determine whether to expand this pilot to additional vulnerable species. So if you're not already subscribed to our listserv, you can go on the EPA Pesticides Program's website, sign up for an email listserv, and we're going to be providing updates on all of this moving forward. Okay, next I want to talk about a draft strategy that we released last year to address the impacts of herbicides on agricultural use for endangered species. This is a really big deal. This is probably one of the biggest things that we're doing to move forward with our obligations for endangered species. And so what it basically is that we have put out for public comment a draft framework. This is not a rule, it's not a regulation. You can really think of it as a framework for how we're going to do business internally, right? With the goal of addressing pesticide impacts for conventional herbicides used in agriculture on federally endangered species. We think that this draft strategy, once it's finalized, is going to begin protecting over 900 federally endangered species. That's 900 of 1,600. And that's really important because if we are sued, we need to be able to tell a court that we're actually making some headway on protections for endangered species. And I think 900 out of 1,600 is a really good number to show. So what is this draft herbicide strategy? We're going to be finalizing it later this year, but there's really two parts of it, three parts. The first part is we ask this question, do we even need to protect this species? Because that's not going to be the case, right, for every single herbicide and species. Some species are so far away from herbicide use, or the particular herbicide isn't actually toxic to that species. So if the answer is no, then we're done, right? But in many cases, the answer is going to be yes, especially for endangered plants, right? Herbicides are oftentimes going to be adversely affecting endangered plants. So then the question is, what types of mitigations or protections are needed to begin protecting some of these species that are affected by herbicides? So those protections get to what I said earlier, runoff, erosion, drift, right? And then they're also designed to address the likelihood of jeopardy, right? That's the concept I talked about in the second slide. We cannot make an endangered species more endangered through the use of herbicides and other pesticides. And those mitigations are specific to the use of the pesticide and also the rate. So we're trying to tailor it to some degree so that it's not this sort of broad blanket, approach to regulation. And then the third approach is how do we actually implement this new strategy? And we're going to say more about that when we finalize the strategy later this year. But for now, I want to offer this example of, you might be wondering, well, how much restrictions are actually going to apply to me when this strategy gets finalized? And our framework for looking at that is to look at what is the type of crop that the herbicide is being applied to, and look at the number of points or mitigation points that are needed to actually meet the herbicide strategy. So let me just give you an example. Let's look at dicamba on corn. So that's sort of third column over, fourth row down, right? And it says 6. So that means there's 6 mitigation points that are needed if you're using dicamba on corn in order to meet the requirements of the herbicide strategy once we incorporate it into actual pesticide decisions. So how do you get those 6 points? Well, we are providing a menu of mitigation options that are going to continue growing and growing. So these are just examples of some of the mitigation options out there right now. And what I haven't put in the slide to keep the slide simple is that it's the number of points associated with each of these options. So you can imagine when this gets finalized, each of these options will have a specific point. And what a grower can do is you can add up, right? Pick and choose from these options to get to 6 points. And we're doing that to provide flexibility. Because what we've done in the past is basically say, you must do X, Y, and Z, period. You don't really have flexibility or options to pick from. What we want to do right now, moving forward, is to say, we're going to give you as big of a menu as possible, right, of mitigation options to pick from. And you figure out which are the ones that work best for your field and for your type of crop and use. So that's how this mitigation menu is actually going to work. We are in a process of trying to expand this menu, especially to fruit and vegetable growers, to specialty crop growers. A lot of this is still based on sort of row crops right now, and we're actively working with growers and others to figure out, what are additional practices that we can add to the menu later this year. Okay, so I've talked about the herbicide strategy. I've talked about how we're going to try to bring herbicides into compliance using this big strategy. We're going to try to do the same on rodenticides, on insecticides, and on fungicides. So these are our milestones, and these are all part of a court settlement agreement that we entered into last September in order to address basically a decade-old lawsuit against the agency for failure to comply with the ESA. So basically, what that settlement agreement says is that we have to meet some of these deadlines for releasing a final strategy that addresses the use of 11 rodenticides. So you can imagine rodenticides can have a lot of impacts on endangered species because a rat gets poisoned, it's sort of, walking around, a bird of prey eats it, that bird of prey gets poisoned, that bird of prey is an endangered species, we have an Endangered Species Act violation, right? So we have a strategy to address that. We have a strategy for insecticides that covers agricultural use of those pesticides. So we expect to have a draft strategy no later than July of next year. So we're currently actively working on that. And then a final strategy by March of 2025. Next, we also want to address fungicides. We don't have a date for that yet. We're currently figuring all of that out. And then, not really relevant to the Southeast, but in Hawaii, which has the most endangered species of any state in the nation, we are going to have a workshop in March to figure out what are all the protections that we need for as many Hawaiian species as once and just get as much of it done as possible. So that's a really exciting opportunity to move forward with compliance. Okay, last thing I want to show, and this is actually a map from Dr. Culpepper and his student, Jenna, who's also here, is you might be wondering, well, what are things that we can all do right now to make all of this work easier for growers and so forth? And a big thing we're focused on this year are better maps for endangered species. So here's sort of an example, right? This is actually for a salamander species in Georgia, where previous to all of this work, all we knew was that the salamanders occur in certain counties and nothing else. So if a salamander occurs in a county, that entire county is off-labeled, or there are going to be restrictions to the entire county. Even though the salamander, we all know, only occurs in part of that county, right? The salamander does not live on agricultural sort of lands. Those lands are not compatible with the habitat for the species. If you look at historic habitat for that salamander, then you actually get 69,000 sort of acres in Georgia across 11 counties. So that actually reduces down to 7%. But through this collaboration that we've been doing with Dr. Culpepper, UGA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we are actually trying to create better, more refined maps on where exactly these species are occurring, and therefore, where do pesticide restrictions really need to be applied? And in these initial pilots that Dr. Culpepper has been working on, you can really see that the actual habitat for that salamander is now down to, roughly 3,000 acres across 11 counties in Georgia, right? So this is how we're using better science to actually have more targeted protections for endangered species, but also lower the regulatory burden on pesticide users. Because all those areas where we don't need pesticide restrictions, we're very happy to take them off of the label, but we need the maps, we need the science to know what are those areas. So we're working feverishly with UGA, Fish and Wildlife Service, other stakeholders to try to get as many of these maps done in the next year or two so that the herbicide strategy, the vulnerable species strategy, all of those things, when they're actually implemented, will have maps that are as tight and narrow as possible so that we can say we're really not over-regulating for all of you. So that was the last thing I wanted to say. There's a lot more in this work that's relevant, but I just wanted to give you a taste of why this is important, why this is happening now, and give you all a chance to ask any questions too. I also welcome my colleague Jan to see if anything she wants to add to all of this work. Great.
Do we have any questions for Mr. Jay? Yes, sir.
Are the endangered species, that list, is that growing or is it stable? Or?
Yeah, great question. So it is growing. In fact, 1,600 is probably much less than the real number of endangered species in the US. Part of the reason it's not higher is that there's only so much funding that the Fish and Wildlife Service has to list these species. Every listing takes a few years. But my expectation is that in the next 5 to 10 years, the number of endangered species will probably grow by a few hundred. Yeah. In the back?
How do you measure success of these practices?
How do we measure success, you mean? Yeah, great question. So we're really looking to ensure that these practices are efficacious in the first place, right? So we're not going to adopt a practice unless there's some data, either quantitative or qualitative, to indicate some level of effectiveness. And part of what we're doing is actually looking at USDA and NRCS data on the effectiveness of some of these practices, looking at the open literature and so forth. So that's sort of the first point. The second point, and we're still trying to figure this out, is what is some type of record-keeping requirement to determine, how are these practices being implemented, to what extent, and what's actually happening on the ground. So we're still figuring all of that.
Jay, we have one more right here.
Have there been any cases of application of pesticides where it has harmed, that we found that it has harmed the endangered wildlife species?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question because oftentimes you have to do some pretty extensive monitoring, right, to figure out like what is that direct causation. What we've heard is that in the Pacific Northwest on salmon, there have been some monitoring that indicates levels of pesticides that may be harming some of these salmon. Certain laboratory studies you can deduce, right, if you apply a pesticide to a salmon, the salmon are going to start acting in weird ways. But it's not sort of widespread in the sense that there aren't people on private farms trying to monitor the death of endangered species, right? A lot of this is, we know these pesticides have adverse effects. We know the endangered species are there. So we can make some inferences that, yes, these species are being harmed.
Yes.
So with these standards that they're developed, would they be applied to existing labels? How would, like products that are currently labeled, how would that?
Yep. Yeah, great question. So I'll just use the herbicide strategy as an example, right? So as I said, that's a strategy for all agricultural uses of herbicides. That strategy actually gets implemented through the pesticide registration and re-registration process, right? So you can imagine as a pesticide comes up, let's say a new pesticide, a conventional pesticide, as part of the registration process, we look at that herbicide strategy to say, what are these mitigation measures and how do we apply it there? For existing pesticides, which is what you talked about, that's that 15-year registration review process. And when this herbicide strategy is finalized, we're going to start applying it to these existing herbicides in registration review. So that's how it all gets implemented.
Any other questions? All right, thank you, Jeff.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate it.
Sir. All right, up next, we will have Dr. Stanley Culpepper to give us a herbicide and weed update.
All right, good morning, everybody. I am going to give you, we've had a really good year, and I'm going to give you an update on really some cool labels and new tools that we have in our toolbox if you're a specialty crop grower. But before I do that for just a minute or two, I kind of want to take a big picture look at as a pesticide update, really about Georgia's commitment for pesticide stewardship. Many of you are aware, back in 2014, we developed what we call in Georgia the Using Pesticides Wisely program. We implemented that program really with Extension, and my Georgia Department of Agriculture colleagues are over here. We developed a program that we wanted to prevent drift, right? Something we don't like in Extension is when drift occurs and we have to go to a scenario and we have two great farmers that are not happy with one another, right? So that was very important to us because we had 289 drift complaints. Think about that. The Cooperative Extension Service at the University of Georgia was out in the field between two unhappy people 289 times in 2014. So we developed the Using Pesticides Wisely program. Our growers are committed to stewardship. Extension is committed to stewardship. And I just wanted to kind of give you an update. If you look again at 2014, that's 289 drift complaints. If you look at 2023, that's a reduction in 90% of off-target movement documented by the University of Georgia Cooperative Extensions. I want to thank you as a pesticide applicator, because none of it matters at all if you're not committed to the cause of putting these products on target and keeping them on target, which is right in line with what Jake was just talking about. I also wanted to mention, Jake mentioned that the work plan, he released a work plan, vulnerable species, EPA herbicide strategy. These things are important. Babesh talked about Bravo earlier. The EPA does not have to allow us the opportunity to give them our comments and our feedback. They do, all right? Again, they don't have to do that. That's a wonderful opportunity for us to provide information to them. And I just wanted to share with you on herbicide strategy, which will absolutely change agriculture, there's no doubt whatsoever. 28 of our county extension offices developed letters. 16 farmers signed on those letters, but also our cooperative extension agents worked with 31 different growers that submitted labels on their own, right? You have to be engaged. These are great people, but if they do not understand what we do, how we do it, or why we do it, how can you expect them to make the right decision? We have to put some of that on us. We have to be engaged. And I'll also point out that's following the year earlier, we got some challenges with diuron. We had 32 extension agents and 580 growers that signed on those diuron comments. It is important. Again, how can you expect them to get it right if they don't understand what we do, why we do it, or how we do it? And another example is being engaged. I just wanted to point out, you may recognize this guy down here who's speaking, but there's Jake, there's Jan. This is the third time that Jake has been in Georgia visiting Georgia agriculture in the last 2 years. This is the second time Jan's been here in like the last 7 or 8 months, right? So they are doing an amazing job, committed to getting this right. We need to take that opportunity. Take the time. They're here today. They're leaving on an airplane later today. Speak to them. Talk to them. They are wonderful people. You have to take the opportunity to engage so they can understand what we do and how we do it. All right, now with that said, we really got some cool stuff going on. I don't know how long the cool stuff will last, but I'm going to share that with you. We got a bunch of new labels this year in 2023. Now, a lot of my labels, let me stress, you guys are from all over the planet. The labels that I'm talking about mostly, not all of them, but mostly are state labels for Georgia, all right? So don't go home and check and make sure you have the label before you use the tool in your state. And then if I have a chance, I'm gonna revisit some cool tools that we got last year. So really, if you look over the last 2 years, we've really done an amazing job in specialty crops, all right? Before I do that, though, and this is a little bit of a complex slide, I want you to understand how complicated this is and how important relationships are and how important working together is to achieve this success, all right? So when you bring a herbicide, think about a herbicide, what a herbicide can do to your vegetable crop, right? If you own that herbicide, you're a little sensitive about bringing that into a $30,000 per acre tomato crop, right? You're kind of running the other way. So there's not a lot of effort, say in produce like it is in corn or wheat or soybeans, and bringing these new tools to the market, especially a herbicide, right? So if you look across the top line, I've got really just a university, your university. You got IR4. You've heard me talk about IR4. I think Roger's in the room. Roger's absolutely essential to our sustainability, being an IR4. And then you have the registrant. So somebody identifies a need. We need to control weed X in this crop. Usually that's a farmer that calls. Sometimes it's Sunday morning at 7 o'clock, right? But that's a farmer that helps us identify it. And then it's my job to go out and try to find a tool that would fit. But me alone equals nothing, right? It's IR4 really that is the hub of the process that gets us going. And again, without them, we would not be successful. Now I have to stress, if the registrant, it's their product, if they say, no, I don't want to take product X into this vegetable, it does not happen, right? So again, you have to have all three of those organizations committed and working together to try to find the tool for the farmer. Then if that works, we go nowhere without the US EPA. We go nowhere without Jake and Jan. Then, if that works, we go nowhere without our Georgia Department of Agriculture if we're bringing you a state label. If you're in another state, that's your state Department of Agriculture that does that. And that's all of these organizations working together to support our family farms. And I think that's amazing. Most of you know I'm from a bicentennial family farm, and I cherish the opportunity to work here. If any one of these organizations is not committed to supporting the family farm, it does not happen. And just to give you an idea, in Georgia, right now we have 17 active state herbicide labels, all because of that group. That's over 30 crops, with many of these different crops having multiple labels available. If we lose these tools, we would be absolutely catastrophically devastated, no doubt whatsoever. So I want to bring recognition to, number one, how complicated it is, number two, about the relationships, and number three, about working together, because we do understand the importance of our family farms and the mission to feed the world. Now, with that said, let's talk about some new products. All right, this one, I'm a year or two late, but Reflex we now have labeled in the state of Georgia for sweet potato. It's a really, really commonly used herbicide across our state. There's nothing special. We should have really, really good tolerance. I'm not too worried about injury. We can go 12 to 16 ounces of product per acre. I've got the definitions of how to use it, but if you're doing sweet potato, you're currently using Valor. Basically, we would tank mix with Valor to improve yellow nutsedge suppression and maybe broaden control. It's the same use pattern. You got to be out in front. We want to irrigate, and we transplant into it. It's a really, really good tool. All right, so again, just another tool in the toolbox. Don't use it if you don't need it, because we're using a lot of Reflex in, say, cotton and soybeans, et cetera, and we have a little bit of a resistance issue. But it is a tool that's available for you. We also got a Reflex label for use in eggplant. All right, so we've already got you a label for tomato and pepper. I wanted to get one for eggplant, especially if we put Reflex under, say, the plasticulture, and we put it under the plastic and you're growing tomato or you're growing pepper. So you could throw eggplant on there at some point if you needed to. But you can use 12 to 16 ounces per acre. If you decided you wanted to go bare ground, we form the beds, we apply it, we irrigate, we transplant into it. We should be in really good shape. That's a good tool, as you know, for some of our most problematic weeds. And we can also put it under the mulch if you wanted to do eggplant first crop. You now have an additional tool with your Devonol type products that you can put under there. I'm less confident on the eggplant than I am with the sweet potato, so try slowly. Remember, if a registrant brings a new corn herbicide, you've got hundreds and hundreds of scientists that have evaluated that across the country. Hundreds, not counting the registrant themselves have evaluated it. When I bring you a tool like this is me and my team that have done a handful of studies. That is it, right? And that's why these labels are indemnified, and you have to go get your own indemnified label. All right, so I'm really excited about Rely. Believe it or not, Miss Jenna, who is my technician, and I should have done that on the first slide. My first slide, my co-authors, Miss Jenna is my technician. She's still in my program. But I also had Camp Hand, Taylor Randall, Singleton, and forgot who else I had on the slide. But they are absolutely, Hannah Wright. Smith is also on the slide. Those three guys are all graduates, but I'm going to share with you some of the work that they have done. All right? And we actually started this work back in 2015. But we've got a Rely label on cantaloupe, cucumber, squash, watermelon, and tomato and pepper. All right? But you have to know what you're doing. If you don't know what you're doing, you're going to get significant damage. All right, so let's first talk about the cantaloupe, cucumber, summer squash, and watermelon. This is a pre-plant. For the pre-plant application, it is only for mulch. It is not for bare ground. So we do not apply Rely to clean up bare ground and then transplant into it, only with mulch. All right, so we can use anywhere between 29 and 43 ounces per acre. You can make up to 2 applications, so we have a very flexible, good tool to help you clean up that plastic culture. We need to have at least 3 days between the application and you punching the mulch, and of course you have to wash the plastic before you punch the hole in the mulch for the transplant. All right, that's absolutely essential. If you end up in an old hole or you end up within 6 inches of the old hole, remember we have shown you over the last couple of years this product has more residual activity than you think. There's a lot of concentration in the old hole, you will get damage. All right, so you need to be aware that that can happen to you. Here's just a picture to remind you, if you do not wash this product off the mulch, this is what you're going to see. You're welcome to send me a picture, but no need to call and fuss or tell me anything else, because it's going to happen and it's going to happen every time. All right? So a very important tool, but for those 4 cucurbit crops, it's just in a plasticulture production system. We don't define the plasticulture, but you've got to have plasticulture. So think about small bed mulch and large bed mulch. All right? So here's an example of why we don't do it bare ground. Here you have no Rely applied pre-plant. You have it bare ground pre-plant, you will get a significant amount of damage. Again, don't think Rely/Liberty does not have residual activity, because on our soils and our production practices, we absolutely do have residual activity. All right, for row middles now, it doesn't matter if you're on plasticulture or you're on bare ground production. You have a row middle tool now for your toolbox. You can make up to 2 row middle applications as long as we don't exceed 62 ounces per acre. Don't get within 6 inches of the vines. All right, so as far as potential damage from row middle applications, and you compare our 3 non-selectives, Roundup Drift will cause you the most damage financially. You won't see it, right? It doesn't spot, it doesn't speckle. You don't think it's hurting you, but Roundup potentially causes you the greatest damage. Paraquat, it shows exactly what you're doing, right? If you don't have a good application procedure, you'll speckle it all up, which will help you understand you need to apply it a little better, right? But Paraquat generally causes the least long-term impact as long as fruit is not in the field. Rely is going to be right in the middle. It's going to be right in the middle. All right, so you need to make sure you keep the product in the row middle and you do not get it on your produce. We can make a significant number of applications and we can use a significant amount of product, right? So a really, really good tool for us. All right, let's talk about tomato and pepper. A little bit different than the cucurbits. You can do pre-plant application on both bare ground and on mulch. So lots of applications are available. The rate is really good. We can go up to 87 totally. You, again, in a mulch system, you have to remove the herbicide from the mulch or you're going to have a significant problem when we go into the mulch system. 2 applications in the mulch system, and we can go up to not to exceed 64 ounces per acre. So again, pre-plant, bare ground or mulch, Rely is now labeled for use in tomato and pepper production. And again, it's a very good tool. Now, I want to show you just a little bit of data, because this is something that you hadn't thought about. I know some of you have been experimenting with Rely, and again, Rely is the product's going to be labeled for vegetables. Obviously, you're very familiar with Liberty and agronomic crops, same active ingredient. But I want to show you this because this is something some of you are not thinking about. All right, so this is wild radish. Wild radish is becoming one of our most problematic weeds across the deep south. If you go with Rely by itself at 32 ounces per acre, it's not so good. If you go with Roundup, it's really good if it's small. Most of you don't think it's good, Roundup's good on wild radish. That's because we're spraying burn down and it's knee high or waist high. But it's 4 to 5 inches. It's a very effective tool. However, if we mix Rely and Roundup together, you can see we reduce the activity from Roundup. So there is a significant amount of antagonism when you mix those 2 products together. All right, let's go to goosegrass. Goosegrass is one of the most concerning weeds that we have agronomically or horticulturally across the state. You need to understand the challenges of controlling goosegrass. You need to be very, very specific. Rely alone is not very good. Roundup, if it's the first treatment, you haven't damaged that goosegrass. If it's the first treatment and you don't have resistance, should be very good. I'll note my weed size. And it's my 2 to 3 inches, not your 2 to 3 inches. All right? So that's very important for you to understand. But if we put the combination together, we don't kill it. And let me tell you, if you miss goosegrass with the first shot, we're probably not going to kill it. All right, we can keep dumping stuff. You can go with your clethodim, you can go select, you can go with these other products. But if we damage it the first time and we don't get it, you're in trouble. Here's another one, common purslane. We have a major issue with purslane across the state. Now, I will point out, I changed my rate of glyphosate here. I do not play with 32 ounces of, say, Roundup Power Max 2 or 30 ounces of Roundup Power Max if I'm going after purslane. So my rate is significantly higher. But my point here is realize not all that great. If I go with glyphosate by itself, I'm much better. It's not great. But if I put a combination together, I get less control. All right? So what I'm telling you is you need to think about, you got a new tool in the toolbox, but you need to think about, with these problematic weeds, make a Roundup application, follow with either Paraquat or your Rely 5 days or so, and you should be in really, really, really good shape with most of the weed species that we've got. All right, so let me also point out we updated. We lost a Treflan label for intercropping. Some of you may or may not know, but a significant acres in Georgia, we intercrop melons with cotton. I actually have a picture here. You can see the melon growing on the plastic. Here's the cotton that's growing along the side. It's been going on since, almost 15 years now, if not more, so it's a very stable production system. We had a label for Treflan. When Treflan went from basically Dow/Corteva over to Gowan, we lost that label, but thanks to Gowan's support, we now have the label back. And we have the label for where we can intercrop. This can be intercropping for any cucurbit and cotton, right? So we can lay that small bed mulch. We can go out there and put some Treflan. If we're in there with watermelon, we'd put a little reflex with it. We wouldn't do that for cantaloupe. We would irrigate it, we'd wash it off, then we could go in and transplant, poke our holes and transplant into a weed-free scenario. So again, just another nice tool to have in the toolbox, new label that's expanded on an old label. And again, just an example, we've done a lot of work where we looked at cantaloupe, watermelon, or squash. So we're ready to go with the weed control program depending on what you as a grower want to do with production. So I'm a little bit hesitant to talk much about the new label we got in Georgia for Embed Extra, but I do just want to briefly bring it to your attention. I'd prefer really you give us an extension another year or two to work with this. It is labeled, it is good to go, but it's one that concerns me about somebody making an error that could be a big deal. So I want to share it with you, introduce it to you, but I'd encourage you to let us work on it a little bit more. So we have an Embed Extra. If you're not familiar with Embed Extra, it's the active ingredient is 2,4-D choline, which would be the same agronomically as Enlist 1. And we have a label where we can essentially, let me say, when we developed the label, my thinking was a little bit in line with what Jake was talking about. We have to figure out how to mitigate pesticides leaving our fields. I am really concerned about plasticulture production because the mitigation menu is not robust at all. All right, so one of the things that I was thinking about that would have big effect is if we get a cover crop established in between our beds, right, we would need to leave it at least long enough to prevent runoff of the pesticide. I think this could be a really good mitigation measure. But how do I keep the weeds out of this grass crop? You know, ryegrass is very common, wheat, rye, we can do. How do I keep the weeds out of the row middle so we don't have all kinds of weeds that are fostering insects and diseases? All right, so that's really where the Embed Extra work came from. Again, that was Camp Hand many years ago. But the label allows us to go in on mulch-covered beds and in row middles and apply up to 1.5 pints 30 days before planting, or two pints at 45 days. Again, I would encourage you to let us work on this a little bit more. We have to have a rainfall at least, so we apply the Embed Extra, we have to get a rainfall at least 7 days before we go into the field, all right? So that's very, very important. We can only make applications, and this is my doing, not Corteva's doing, applications here, because I don't want 2,4-D choline running around all these produce areas, right? It makes common sense that we need to protect ourselves there. And we obviously do not need to spray this product anywhere near any sensitive locations, whether that's in the field or in a greenhouse. So again, this is a tool to try to help us remove the weeds from old plasticulture, row middles, while potentially leaving a grass row middle cover crop to keep the product in the field. I'll show you, again, no damage on the left. This is one row of broccoli, one row of cabbage. No herbicides on the left. 2,4-D where there are no holes, right? You wash it off, and this is, again, is Embed Extra. It's very important. That's a specific formulation. They interact differently, potentially, on the plastic. And then on the right, what you saw is we put the holes in the plastic and then we sprayed it and we put it in. Remember, 2,4-D has residual activity, right? So if you go stick a plant in an old hole where we have the product there, you will get damage. You'll even get damage on cold crops, which are far more tolerant than cucurbits, all right? So if you go in with a cucurbit, this would be way more damaging. So again, give us some time or experiment on super small acres to get comfortable with it if it fits you. Now, I just want to negate this because I am so frustrated with vegetable growers and vegetable agriculturalists calling me about dicamba. No way are we bringing a label for dicamba to go over plastic. If you look at the herbicide residue remaining on plastic at 15, 30, or 45 days, dicamba has a tremendous amount of product left on the plastic, 2,4-D. That is why the 2,4-D choline is working in the system, because we can get it off the mulch. The dicamba comes off, but it comes off 4 to 6 weeks. So what happens is no dicamba here, there's your squash. Here's 1 day, 15 days, 30 days, even 45 days. You have a tremendous amount of damage. So quit calling me about dicamba. We don't need dicamba on a produce farm as far as I'm concerned. All right? I know agronomically it is an essential tool for us, but you have to be very intelligent with what you're doing or it can absolutely destroy you. So just very quickly, I'll remind you, we got some Prowl satellite hydrocap labels last year. I will point out, I think Prowl has a nice fit as a row middle tool to add to what you're doing. Again, just another tool in the toolbox. We can go up to 2 pints per acre. If you're not going to get rain within 5 days on your large bed plasticulture, we don't have irrigation, don't put it in there. But if you have a chance for rainfall or you can manipulate irrigation, I think it's a good tool. I showed you guys a little bit of this last year. I was trained that really your yellow herbicides controlled weeds similarly. I'm learning at least for some weeds that's not true. On the left, we're comparing Sonaland to Prowl on primrose control, cutleaf eminent primrose. Prowl is more effective. If you look at carrot production, where we're comparing Treflan to Prowl on radish, again, Prowl is more effective. Now, let me stress this out. I think Prowl is a good row middle material. I'm not telling you to go put Prowl out in front of your crop, because damage from Prowl in some of these crops is far greater than Treflan. All right, so make sure you don't miscommunicate that. I'm talking about in a row middle where we have no concern of crop tolerance. If you're doing it prior to planting a crop, you make sure you're using the right product, because they're not the same, right? So when you think about Treflan, Sonaland / Curbit, or Prowl, they're showing to be a little bit different. So you need to think that through. All right, I do want to recognize we're in a pesticide update. But look, the weed control toolbox is in trouble. There's no doubt about it. Herbicide resistance is a monumental challenge for us. Potential regulations are a monumental challenge for us. We have to at least be researching and looking aggressively to find alternatives to put in the system. The tool that you think is most valuable to you, if we don't bring some kind of alternative into the system, that tool is not going to last. And if we're talking about Palmer amaranth or ryegrass, we're generally talking about 3 to 5 years, right? So we're looking at all kinds of these alternatives. Don't forget about deep turning the land. A lot of our problem weeds can emerge if they're from 4 inches or deeper. That's not the case with all weeds. Nutsedge is clearly an exception. But if you hadn't deep turned in a while, that's a good tool for you. Cover crops where we can use it is very effective on many weed species. I will say we're doing some work with the laser weeder. It's really, really cool, right? I cannot provide you weed control in seeded onions. I do not have the tools in the toolbox to do it. This operation is absolutely kicking my butt. All right, so I know some of the challenges. There are a lot of challenges, but if we don't start the research and we're not committed to the research and following through, we never get to where we need to be. All right, and this is actually Miss Jenna down here in the bottom right-hand corner. She's actually putting pollen out from Israel, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to keep the seed from being viable, right? If you win the war with weed control, you win with the weed seed bank. All right, so we want to eliminate or reduce that weed seed bank. So again, we may never see a single one of you doing it. Or maybe 10 years from now, that's something that you have a little robot that goes around and puffs out pollen to prevent weeds from having viable seed. How cool is it, right? You don't know. We have to look at it. So I just want to also highlight, we've got a lot of young, energetic vegetable agents. And most days that's a really, really good thing. Every once in a while they wear me out because they got a lot of energy. So they are identifying a lot of needs that we need to work on. They're all over me on purslane. They're all over me on ragweed parthenium. All right? They're all over me now on alligator weed. Right? You need to pay attention to these weeds. They're on the move, and we do not, in most cases, have great scenarios to control them. all right? I will mention nutsedge is always at the big discussion, but I'm going to have a whole nutsedge session this afternoon. So I'm not going to talk about nutsedge here in the next minute or two. I'll just tell you, if you're interested in nutsedge, whether it's plasticulture, bare ground, whatever, we're going to do the whole gamut, I think at 1:30, all right? So I can't talk about all these weeds because I'm going to run out of time, but I wanted to just mention purslane for a minute. I showed you guys this last year. If you want to control purslane, I don't care what crop you are in, the concept is the same. You overlap residual herbicides. On the right, every one of these herbicides, residual-wise, if you get it activated, is very effective. All right? If you look at post-emergence tools, you have very few. So you need to understand the concept of overlapping residual herbicides. So on the far left, if you look at the top red line, that's the day we apply that residual product and you get it activated. That's the most effective it's going to be for the life of that product. As time goes on, whether it's photodegradation, whether it's microbial degradation, whether you till it and you kill the activity, we're losing activity. Before that herbicide gets to the point where it no longer prevents the emergence of the first emergence of that weed you're trying to control, you apply another residual herbicide that's effective. That is the most effective approach, especially in vegetable production with short season crops, if you want to manage most of your most problematic weeds. Whether it's purslane, goosegrass, palmer amaranth, they're all the same. All right? So it's a very effective tool. And again, this will give you an idea if you're looking at purslane control really in produce, that's all I got. All right? Post-emergence by itself, that's all I got. You got nothing. We've got to keep it from coming up. If you're going pre-plant burn down, this is a study that Ty Torrance and I are doing. If you go pre-plant burn down, you got to again be careful. Here's an example of Roundup Power Max at 64 ounces alone. If we add Liberty or Reflex to it, we reduce the control. You have hurt yourself. If we add these products in the middle, 2,4-D, Valor, Caprol, Break, or Command, we don't really change control. If we add Gold or Atrazine or 2,4-D, we improve control, right? So residuals are the easiest and simplest way to do it, and we're trying to learn more about post-emergence tools. 2 more slides and then I'm going to be quiet. I will remind you, I don't understand why we're letting grasses harm us the way they are. I didn't go on a single vegetable operation or a single farm this year where grasses were not a significant challenge in that field. We can control most of the grasses, all right? It depends on you being timely and also you understanding if you're using one of these clethodim formulations that are not Select Max and you're going with a surfactant to reduce injury, you're not going to get the level of control that you would with Select Max or that product with crop oil. All right? If you put crop oil, you get more injury. So it's something to think about. If you're struggling on what to do, 21 days after you go into a field that's weed-free, spray a grass control product. That would pay off 10 to 1 almost every scenario. Grasses are extremely competitive. And this is my last slide. I just wanted to mention, I'm not going to talk anything about fumigation right now. We'll talk about that this afternoon a little bit in the nutsedge session. But I want to remind you with plasticulture, the number one problem we're having is you're applying products over the plastic and you're not washing the plastic. If you look at this picture, it's really kind of cool. So you see the bubbles? All right, that is not anything that we made bubble other than that's the adjuvant from the glyphosate that's still on the plastic. So you go through and you think you can figure out how to wash it off. Well, if you don't put enough water, what you do is you see a bunch of bubbles. That means the glyphosate's still on the plastic. So when you go in and transplant and it rains, that glyphosate splashes up off that plastic and you have damage. All right, so you need a ½ an inch of rainfall or irrigation to remove these products comfortably from this plastic. Now, can we figure out how to do it like this? Absolutely, we've already done it. But the amount of water we're going to have to carry, most of you are not even close. You're not even on the same planet as what we're on. All right? So you just need to be aware of that. And Rely and glyphosate are going to be in the same game. Paraquat's a little less sensitive to that, but you still have to wash that off the plastic. With that said, I will close out and say I've got the laminated circulars that I normally bring for the cold crops. You know, you brought your broccoli, cabbage, cauliflower, the leafy greens, collard, kale, mustard, turnip, summer squash, sweet potato, watermelon. They're all over there on that table on the far right. If you want one, we updated them with all the labels. You're welcome to take one. Anybody got a quick question for me? Because I'm going to get us done. All right, turn it.
Thank you, Dr. Culpepper. All right, well, that concludes the vegetable session for this morning.